She stepped off that train in a dress meant for Boston parlors, carrying a trunk she could barely lift, staring at a man holding a sign with her name on it. And behind him, nothing but frozen grass and sky for as far as she could see. He had promised her a prosperous homestead. She had promised him a woman who knew how to run one. They had both lied. And now, standing on a Montana platform in the bitter November wind of 1885, Evelyn Whitlock and Thaddeus Hale looked at each other and understood, in the same terrible moment, exactly what they had done. If you've ever made a decision born from desperation and had to live with it, this story is for you. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The advertisement had been 12 lines long. Thaddeus Hale had spent the better part of a November evening writing it, sitting at the rough-hewn table he'd built himself, a stub of candle throwing unsteady light across the paper. He was not a man who was comfortable with words, not written ones anyway, and he'd crossed out and restarted 4 times before landing on something he figured a woman might actually respond to. Homesteader, 34 Gallatin Valley, Montana Territory. 63 acres under cultivation. Solid cabin. Root cellar stocked, looking for a capable, hard-working woman to share in the work and the life of a frontier farm. Honest man. Not pretty, but not rough either. Will provide stability and a permanent home. He'd almost added lonely, but caught himself. That wasn't the kind of thing a man put in writing. He dropped the letter at the post office in Bozeman on a Tuesday in November, ridden the 14 miles back to his property in the kind of cold that makes your face feel like cracked leather, and told himself he probably wouldn't hear anything back until spring, if ever. He heard back in 6 weeks. The letter from Evelyn Whitlock arrived on a morning so cold that the ink in his pen had thickened to near uselessness, and he had to warm it by the stove before he could write anything. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting small and precise, and elegant in a way that made Thaddeus feel faintly embarrassed about his own blocky letters. He read it twice at the table before he read it a third time standing up, as if the position might change what the words said. Dear Mr. Hale, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Boston Correspondence Registry. My name is Evelyn Constance Whitlock. I am 28 years of age, in good health, and well-versed in the management of a household. I have experience in cooking, preservation, domestic economy, and the care of animals, having grown up in a family home where such skills were expected of the women. I am not afraid of hard work or cold weather. I am looking for a permanent situation in which I can be genuinely useful and build something of lasting worth. I enclose a photograph. I hope it finds you well. Yours sincerely, Evelyn C. Whitlock. The photograph was small, slightly blurry, the way photographs always were back then, and showed a woman with dark hair pinned up neatly, looking directly at the camera with the kind of expression that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't quite serious either. Something in between, something watchful. Thaddeus propped the photograph against the salt cellar on his table and looked at it while he ate his dinner, salt pork and boiled turnips, same as most nights. And he thought, she says she's not afraid of hard work. He'd learn later that Evelyn had written and rewritten that letter 11 times. What the letter did not say was that the Whitlock family home in Boston had been sold at auction 7 months prior to cover debts that Evelyn's father had accumulated over 3 years of bad investments and worse luck. What it didn't say was that the family home where such skills were expected of the women had employed a cook, a housekeeper, and a laundress until the spring of 1884, when all 3 had to be let go. What it didn't say was that Evelyn's experience with the management of a household consisted of watching other people manage one, and that her experience with the care of animals was limited to a brief and unsuccessful attempt to keep a canary alive during the winter of 1882, which she had failed at. What it also didn't say, and this part she had wrestled with more than anything, was that she was frightened, not of Montana, exactly, and not of Thaddeus Hale, whose letter she had read with careful attention, and whose photograph showed a lean, weathered man with a serious face and hands that looked like they knew how to work. She was frightened of the alternative, of the narrow, airless future that had closed around her since her family's money had gone, her aunt's spare bedroom in Cambridge, her cousin's pointed silences about usefulness and contribution, the polite fiction that things would somehow improve on their own. She was 28 years old. She had a good mind, a strong back, and approximately $47 to her name. She answered the advertisement. They exchanged 4 more letters before the agreement was made. Thaddeus wrote about the farm, the acreage, the cow he'd bought in the fall named Duchess, the 2 draft horses, the root cellar that was better stocked than the previous year. He wrote about the valley, which he called rough but beautiful in its way, and about the winters, which he described as cold but manageable with proper preparation. He did not write about the nights that went on so long in January that he'd started talking to Duchess just to hear something that wasn't wind. He did not write about the spring when he'd gotten sick for 3 weeks with no one to bring him so much as water, and had lain in his bunk thinking with uncharacteristic clarity about what his life actually amounted to. Evelyn wrote about herself with the careful accuracy of a woman selecting which truths to offer. She wrote that she was a quick learner. That was true. She wrote that she had managed on very little during the past year and understood frugality. That was also true. She wrote that she was not delicate. That, she believed, was true, though she'd never actually been tested on it. By the time they'd agreed on terms and she had booked passage on the train westward, Thaddeus had convinced himself he was getting a capable frontier woman who'd maybe grown up in a city but had enough common sense and practical experience to adapt quickly. Evelyn had convinced herself she was going to a prosperous, established farm where the hardest part would be adjusting to the pace and scale of the work. Both of them were wrong in almost every particular. The train journey from Boston to Bozeman took 4 days. Evelyn sat in the second-class carriage with her trunk wedged between her knees and watched the country change outside the window. The neat farms of New England giving way to the flat middle distances of Ohio and Indiana. Then the great rolling expanse of the plains, and finally, in the last day, the way the mountains came up out of nowhere and made everything look different. Bigger, less forgiving. She told herself she wasn't scared. She was scared. She was also, underneath the fear, something she couldn't quite name. Curious, maybe. Or committed. She had made a decision and she was on a train going toward it, and there was something clarifying about that, even if clarity wasn't the same thing as comfort. She arrived at Bozeman Station on a Thursday afternoon in late November. The platform was busy. Ranchers and miners, and a few women who moved like they belonged there in a way that Evelyn immediately recognized she did not. She stepped down from the carriage in her gray traveling dress, which was the most practical thing she owned and which was still, she could already see, entirely wrong for this place. And she looked around for the man whose photograph she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for 6 weeks. She found him before he found her. He was standing near the far end of the platform holding a piece of cardboard with Whitlock written on it in large, uncertain letters. He was taller than she'd expected, leaner. His coat was the kind of brown that had originally been some other color and had faded over years of weather. His face, she'd studied the photograph until she had it memorized, looked more tired in person and older, though not in a bad way, in the way of someone who'd been outside and working for a long time. He spotted her a moment later. She could tell by the way his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but something that went through recalibration. She picked up her bag and walked toward him. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Whitlock." He looked at her trunk, which was sitting on the platform looking enormous and out of place. "That everything?" "Yes." He looked at it for another second. "That's a lot of trunk." "I wasn't sure what to bring." "Right." He reached down and picked it up in a way that made it clear it was heavier than he'd expected, though he didn't say anything about it. "Wagon's out front. It's 14 miles to the farm. We should get moving before the light goes." That was, in its entirety, the conversation they had on the platform. The wagon ride was 14 miles of silence, interrupted by occasional practical observations about the road conditions and the weather forecast. Thaddeus drove. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and her traveling bag at her feet, and watched the country open up around them in the late afternoon light. It was, she had to admit, beautiful. Brutally, almost aggressively beautiful, in the way of things that don't care whether you appreciate them or not. The mountains to the south caught the last of the sun and went rose gold and then purple as the temperature dropped. The grass on the valley floor was winter pale and moved in the wind like something breathing. "It's very open," she said, when they'd been riding for about 20 minutes. "It is," Thaddeus agreed. "The letters made it sound—" She stopped. "What?" "More settled," she said, which was not quite what she'd been going to say. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. "It's a working farm," he said finally, "not a town." "Yes, I understand that." Another stretch of silence. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "You said in your letters you had experience with animals," Thaddeus said. Not accusing, just careful. "I've been around animals," Evelyn said, which was, she reasoned, technically accurate. "Cattle?" She hesitated one beat too long. "I haven't worked specifically with cattle," she said, "but I'm a fast learner." Thaddeus made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been something else entirely. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The cabin appeared out of the dusk like something that had grown there rather than been built, low and dark against the pale grass, a thin line of smoke coming from the chimney, a barn set back 50 yards behind it. There was a fence, a woodpile stacked against the south wall, a water pump visible beside the barn. Evelyn looked at it. She had known, intellectually, that it would be small. The letters had said cabin. She had imagined, she could see now, with the clarity of confronting the actual thing, something larger than the word implied. Something with perhaps a covered porch and more than one window. Something that a woman might walk into and find already arranged for habitation in a way that required only her presence to complete. What she was looking at was a structure approximately the size of her aunt's parlor in Cambridge, possibly smaller. Thaddeus pulled the wagon up and set the brake and climbed down and began unhitching the horses without comment. Evelyn sat on the bench for a moment longer than was probably graceful, looking at the cabin, and then climbed down herself and picked up her traveling bag. "I'll show you inside," Thaddeus said, leading the horses toward the barn. "Leave the trunk. I'll get it." She went to the cabin door and opened it and stepped in. It was warm, at least. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning, and it had kept. The space was... She stood in the doorway and took it in. One room, a bunk against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, the stove, a set of rough shelves holding provisions, a second, smaller bunk built into the near wall that hadn't existed in the photograph he'd sent her, which she now understood he'd built specifically for her arrival. Everything was clean. That was the first thing she noticed after the size. The floor had been swept. The table had been wiped. The blanket on the small bunk was folded with an attention to neatness that made her throat tighten slightly, because she could see the effort in it. Whoever Thaddeus Hale was, he'd tried. She set her bag down and stood in the middle of the room and looked at the ceiling, which was low enough that a tall man would have to watch his head near the walls. She had made a terrible mistake. She was absolutely certain of it. She was also standing there in his clean, small, careful cabin, equally certain that she was not going back. Thaddeus came in 20 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots on the threshold. Evelyn had been standing near the stove, warming her hands, not because she'd needed to, but because she hadn't known what else to do with herself. "Horses are settled," he said. He set her trunk down by the door with a care that she suspected cost him something. "Duchess will need milking in the morning. She goes at first light, or she gets difficult." "All right. You know how to milk a cow?" The pause this time was slightly longer than the one in the wagon. "I've seen it done," Evelyn said. Thaddeus looked at her for a moment. His face wasn't angry. It was something more complicated than that. A man adding up a set of figures and getting an answer he'd suspected but hoped was wrong. "You've seen it done," he repeated. "Yes, Miss Whitlock," he said, and then stopped. He pulled off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. He went to the shelf and got down 2 tin cups and a pot and put it on the stove without asking her if she wanted coffee. "How much of what you wrote in those letters was true?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "I said I was a fast learner. That's true." "What else?" "That I wasn't delicate." "What else?" She thought about it honestly. "That I wasn't afraid of hard work." "I believe that's true, though I admit I haven't been tested on it yet to the extent that this situation would appear to require." Thaddeus poured coffee into both cups and set one in front of her. He sat down at the table and looked at her in the straightforward way she was beginning to recognize as his default mode of expression. "I told you the farm was prosperous," he said. She picked up the cup. "I noticed when we arrived that it was not yet quite at that stage." "It's not at any stage near that." He wrapped his hands around his own cup. 63 acres. Half of it's good. The other half's got drainage problems I haven't been able to fix. I've got 2 horses and 1 cow and about enough put by to get through winter if nothing goes wrong. The roof on the barn needs work, and I haven't gotten to it because there's always something else first." He paused. "I said I could offer stability." "You did. What I meant was that I intended to. Eventually." He looked at her steadily. "I should have been clearer about the difference." Evelyn turned the tin cup in her hands. The coffee was bad, too strong, slightly burnt, and she drank it anyway. "I should have been clearer as well," she said. They sat with that for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was starting up, a low, persistent sound that she would learn to read like a language over the coming months. That particular pitch, meaning it'll be below 0 by midnight. "So," Thaddeus said, "what do we do?" It wasn't really a question. "I don't know how to cook much," Evelyn said, "or milk a cow, or most of what you need someone here to do, if I'm honest. But I told you I was a fast learner, and I meant it. I'll learn whatever you can teach me, all of it. I won't complain, and I won't pretend to know things I don't." She set the cup down. "That's what I can actually offer you." Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment. "Honesty," he said, "is about the most useful thing there is out here. More useful than experience most times. Experience you can get. You can't manufacture honest." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "There's 1 bunk," he said, nodding toward the wall, "and 1 bunk." He nodded toward the other. "Dinner's salt pork, and whatever you can find on the shelf. I'll show you where everything is, and you can manage it yourself tonight. That's your first lesson." It was not a romantic beginning by any measure. It was not the beginning she had imagined or the one he'd hoped for, or anything close to what either of them had written in their carefully constructed letters. It was, however, a beginning. The first morning came with a cold so specific and penetrating that Evelyn, who had grown up in Boston winters and considered herself acquainted with cold, understood immediately that she had not previously been acquainted with cold. She understood this the moment she swung her feet out from under the quilts, and they made contact with the cabin floor, which was like touching packed earth through a thin layer of wood. She dressed in every layer she owned. She could hear Thaddeus already up and moving outside. She had to milk Duchess. She had said she would. She had implied, in fact, that she could. She was going to have to figure this out before he came back and found her standing uselessly in the barn doorway. Duchess was a large, dark brown animal who regarded Evelyn's arrival in the barn with the deep suspicion of a creature who had developed opinions about who she was willing to deal with at 5 in the morning. She shifted her weight when Evelyn came in, stamping one back foot against the straw. "All right," Evelyn said, more to herself than to the cow. "I've seen this done. I know what the general procedure involves." She got the stool. She got the bucket. She sat down beside Duchess in the anatomically suggested position and reached for the relevant anatomy. Duchess turned her head and looked at Evelyn with an expression of profound disapproval. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm sorry." What followed was approximately 25 minutes of the most undignified activity of Evelyn Whitlock's adult life. Duchess shifted, stamped, swished her tail in Evelyn's face 3 separate times, and produced about a third of her normal yield in a bucket that Evelyn kept nearly tipping over. By the time Thaddeus appeared in the barn doorway, Evelyn's hands were cramping, her back was aching from the angle, and there was a streak of something she preferred not to identify across her left sleeve. She looked up at him, he looked at the bucket, then at her, then back at the bucket. "That's about a third of what she usually gives," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm aware." "Your hands are wrong." He crossed the barn and crouched beside the stool and showed her, without commentary, without making it worse than it already was, the correct grip and rhythm. His hands were twice the size of hers, and he did it like someone demonstrating something obvious, not like someone proving a point. She watched carefully. She did what he showed her. Duchess grudgingly produced another half bucket. "Better," Thaddeus said. It was the first time he'd said anything to her that had that quality. Not a compliment exactly, because it was too sparse for that, but something adjacent. Acknowledgement. She filed it away. Chit. The days developed a shape that Evelyn clung to because shape was the only thing that made them manageable, up before light. Duchess. Breakfast, which was her responsibility now, and which Thaddeus ate without complaint regardless of how it turned out, which was sometimes badly. In those first 2 weeks, she burned things she hadn't known could be burned, undercooked things that required actual cooking, and produced at least 2 dinners that she was fairly confident he'd fed to the horses when she wasn't looking. He never said anything, he ate what she made and thanked her, and that was that. She didn't know yet whether this was patience or simply a man who'd eaten bad food for so long he couldn't tell the difference anymore. She would find out later that it was both. After breakfast, the farm. Thaddeus worked from first light until it was too dark to see, with a brief stop at midday, and Evelyn had told him she would learn everything, so she followed. She learned to muck out the barn, which was terrible, and to haul water from the pump, which was heavy, and to stack and carry wood, which made her hands bleed where the rough bark caught the skin. She learned the 2 horses, Samson and Belle, and their different tolerances and demands. She learned that the fence on the east side of the property needed weekly checking because there was a section where the posts had shifted and cattle from the neighboring Greer spread sometimes wandered through. She learned to make a serviceable cornbread. She learned to render lard. She learned that salt pork, which she had initially found inedible, could be made better or worse by the way you cooked it, and she was determined to make it better. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked Thaddeus one evening while she was watching what he did with the cast iron pan, because watching was a faster education than trial and error alone. "I didn't really," he said. "I just ate. Whatever I made. You get hungry enough, you figure things out." That's exactly my current situation. He looked at her sideways, and she could see, barely, in the dim light, the edge of something that might have been amusement. "You're doing better than I did my first month," he said. "How bad was your first month?" "Ate half raw beans for 2 weeks because I thought they needed less cooking than they did." He poked at the pan with the spatula. "Then I had to figure out what was wrong with me for the week after that." She laughed. It surprised both of them. She hadn't laughed in weeks, really, not genuinely, and the sound of it in the small cabin was startling. He glanced at her again, and this time she was sure it was amusement, even if it was the quiet kind he kept mostly to himself. "Half raw beans," she said. "I was 23 and I had no idea what I was doing," he said. "Nobody does at first." It was the most he'd said it once since she'd arrived. She didn't push it. She just filed it next to the earlier better and thought about what it meant that he'd offered it. She wrote letters home to her sister Clara in those first weeks. Clara had married a shopkeeper in Providence and was not in a much better financial situation than Evelyn had been, but she was Clara, and writing to her was the only thing that felt continuous with the person Evelyn had been before she'd got on the train. She didn't lie in the letters, not the way she'd lied in the advertisement response, but she was selective. She wrote, "The farm is small and there is much to learn. The work is genuinely hard. Mr. Hale is a serious man who communicates primarily through action rather than conversation, which I have come to see as a form of communication in itself." She wrote, "Montana is nothing like what I expected. I am not sure yet whether that is good or bad. Possibly both." She wrote, "I am not cold in the way I was afraid of being cold, the kind of cold that goes through a person and makes them wonder if they made the right choice. I am the other kind, the kind where you are too busy to think about it for long." She did not write, "I went outside to haul wood this morning, and the sky was the particular blue you only get when it's 10 below zero and completely clear, and I stood there with the axe handle in my hands and thought, this is the most alive I've felt in a year." The end of December brought a cold snap that dropped the temperature to -20 for a week straight. Evelyn learned what the valley's wind sounded like when it was truly serious, a different register from the ordinary November howl, something that made the cabin walls groan and the stovepipe vibrate and pressed in on all sides like something insistent. She also learned, during that week, 2 things about Thaddeus Hale that the letters had not contained. The first, he read, not just practically, not almanacs and farming manuals, though he had those too, actual books. He He had a small shelf of them wedged between the stove and the wall. A few novels she recognized, some history, a battered volume of poetry he clearly hadn't bought for himself because the front page had an inscription from a woman named Margaret. He read at night when the chores were done, by candlelight, with the focused quiet of someone who'd taught himself to disappear into books because sometimes disappearing was necessary. She noticed the poetry volume one evening and said without thinking, "Did you read that?" He looked up, looked at the book. "Some of it." "Which parts?" He was quiet for a moment, like the question required actual consideration rather than deflection. "The parts that sounded like things I'd thought about but couldn't have put into words myself," he said. She looked at him. "That's exactly what poetry is for," she said. He looked back down at the page he'd been reading, but there was a shift in his posture, small, almost invisible, that she catalogued carefully. The second thing she learned during the cold snap, he was worried. About the roof on the barn, which he'd mentioned to her on their first night and hadn't been able to fix. About the east fence, which had to be checked even in this temperature or they'd lose the boundary. About Duchess, who had been eating less for 3 days and whose behavior Thaddeus was watching with the careful attention of someone calculating risks. About the spring, not this coming spring, but all the springs ahead, whether the farm could produce enough, whether the drainage problem could be solved without more money than he had, whether 63 acres was enough to build a real life on or just enough to keep going. He didn't say most of this. She inferred it from watching him. He'd get up in the night sometimes when he thought she was asleep, put on his coat, go out to check the barn. He'd come back in 20 minutes later, shake the snow from his boots, sit at the table for a while before going back to his bunk. One night, about 3 a.m. by her estimate, she heard him get up. She sat up in her bunk. "Is it Duchess?" He turned around, clearly surprised she was awake. "She's fine, just checking." "You do that every night." He didn't answer immediately. "Just a habit," he said. "No, it isn't," she said. You're worried about her." Another silence. "She's the most valuable thing on this farm," he said finally. "Lose her, we lose the milk, and without the milk we lose about 1/3 of our diet this winter and all of the income she'd contribute in the spring." She noticed that. "What are the signs I should watch for?" she asked. "If she's in trouble." He looked at her in the dark for a moment, then he told her. Not briefly. Actually, with the detail of someone explaining something important to someone he decided could be trusted with important things. He described what to look for in Duchess's posture, her water intake, the way she stood in the stall. He told her about a winter 3 years ago when a neighbor's animal had seemed fine until it wasn't, and what the signs had been in retrospect. When he was done, Evelyn said, "All right, I'll watch her in the mornings. You can tell me if I'm seeing it wrong." He went back to his bunk. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling. "We lose." She thought about the word for a long time before she fell asleep. Christmas came and went with no particular ceremony. Evelyn made a pudding from a recipe she'd written down from memory and which turned out better than expected. Dense and heavy and overly sweet but recognizable as the thing it was supposed to be. Thaddeus ate 2 portions and said nothing, which she had by then learned to read as a compliment. She'd found a piece of cloth in her trunk, a scrap of decent blue wool she'd thought she might use for something, though she'd never decided what, and had spent several evenings making him a pair of work gloves. Her sewing was not excellent. The gloves were not beautiful. One was slightly larger than the other in a way she'd failed to notice until they were finished. She set them on the table Christmas morning without comment because she thought making something of it would be worse than not. He picked them up, turned them over, looked at them for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He put them on. They fit, more or less. He went outside and wore them for the rest of the day. She found, when she went to make breakfast, a small paper-wrapped package on the shelf above the stove. Inside was a bar of good soap, the kind that was actually milled properly, not the homemade lye soap they used for general purposes, and a small bottle of hand lotion, which she recognized as the kind sold at the general store in Bozeman. He'd been to Bozeman for supplies 10 days ago. She stood holding the soap and the lotion for longer than necessary, looking at the handwriting on the little paper tag he'd tucked inside. "For your hands. Th." Her hands had been in bad shape since the first week. She'd wrapped them in rags some mornings before the worst of the work. She hadn't complained. She hadn't known he'd noticed. She put the lotion on her hands right then, standing in the cold cabin with the stove just starting to warm, and she thought he noticed. By the time January came fully into its own, which in the Gallatin Valley meant a darkness that was specific and heavy, something that got into the corners of the cabin and stayed there, Evelyn had learned to make bread that rose properly. She had learned to judge Duchess's mood before she sat down to milk her, which saved her time and dignity both. She had learned the difference between the horses' different vocalizations and what each one meant. She had learned to read the sky for weather in the way Thaddeus read it, which was less about cloud formations and more about a kind of atmospheric pressure you felt in your chest before it showed up in any visible form. She had also learned, slowly and without either of them making any particular acknowledgement of it, to have conversations with him. Not long ones. Not, in those early months, the kind of conversations she'd had in Boston drawing rooms where a good conversationalist was someone who could carry a topic from arrival to dessert without it dying. These were different. Short, practical to begin with, then occasionally not. A question about the drainage problem on the North 40 led to a conversation about soil composition that led, sideways, into something she'd read once about agricultural methods in Europe. He knew things she didn't expect him to know. She said things he hadn't expected her to be able to say. They both noticed this, in the way you notice something that recalibrates your picture of another person. One evening in the third week of January, they were both at the table after dinner, him reading, her with a piece of mending, when he said, without looking up, "What did you do?" "Before. In Boston." She kept the needle moving. "We had a household. I managed the social calendar largely. Correspondence. Some tutoring the last few years." "Tutoring what?" "Reading, writing, some arithmetic, children from families who couldn't afford proper schooling." She paused. "I liked it, the tutoring. Were you good at it?" She considered. "I think so. I was patient with the ones who were slow, and I knew when the quick ones needed to be pushed harder." She looked up. "Why?" "Just wondering what you'd left behind," he said, still not looking up. She thought about that. "I hadn't left much," she said, honestly. "The tutoring I'd left. Some friendships, though they'd gotten thin since the money went. A way of life that had stopped actually being mine some time before I stepped on the train." She set the mending down. "What about you? Have you always been here?" He turned a page. "Not always. Came out at 23 from Ohio. Worked 2 years on a cattle operation before I filed for this land." "Do you miss Ohio?" "No." Simple and complete. "There was nothing in Ohio for me. My father's farm. A father who wasn't much good at farming and less good at the other parts." He paused. "When I got here and filed the claim and stood on this particular piece of ground, it was the first time I'd stood somewhere that was actually mine. Not borrowed or inherited or suffered through. Mine." She understood that in a way she wouldn't have 6 months ago. "That's worth a great deal," she said. "It is," he said, "which is why I work as hard as I do to keep it." They sat quietly for a while. The fire was steady. Somewhere outside, the wind was doing its usual January thing, but in the cabin it was warm enough, and the lamplight was steady, and it was, Evelyn thought, the most comfortable she'd been since she arrived. Not comfortable in the soft Boston sense. Comfortable in a different sense. The sense of being exactly where you were supposed to be, even if where you were supposed to be was still difficult and cold and uncertain. She picked up the mending again. He turned another page. That was how January ended. Not dramatically, not with anything she could have pointed to as a turning point. Just two people in a cabin figuring out how to occupy the same space, which was, she was beginning to understand, more than most people managed. February came in mean, not the quiet, grinding cold of January, which had at least been consistent. You knew what you were dealing with, you dressed for it, you moved through it. February came in with mood swings. 3 days of relative warmth that softened the top inch of snow into a crust that made walking treacherous, then a night that dropped back to -15 and froze everything into a glittering, deceptive hardness. Wind that shifted direction without warning. A week of flat gray sky that pressed down on the valley like a hand and refused to move. Evelyn had been in Montana for 11 weeks. She could now milk Duchess in under 15 minutes, which was a fact she had not imagined being proud of 4 months ago, and which she was genuinely proud of now. She could make 5 things for dinner that qualified as actual meals, rather than approximations of meals. She could read the horses well enough to know when Samson was just being difficult and when something was actually wrong. And she had learned the difference the hard way during a Tuesday morning in late January when she dismissed his restlessness as stubbornness, and Thaddeus had come in from the fence line to find the horse had worked a splinter deep into his left foreleg and needed attention immediately. She had not made that mistake again. What she still couldn't do, what she suspected would take much longer than 11 weeks, was read the land the way Thaddeus read it. He walked the same ground every day and saw things she couldn't see yet, where the drainage problem was getting worse after the thaw, where the fence posts were heaving from the freeze-thaw cycle, where Duchess had been grazing versus where she'd been avoiding, and what that said about the grass quality in different sections. He carried a running calculation in his head that she was only beginning to understand the scope of. Everything on this farm was connected to everything else, and the margin for error was thinner than she'd imagined when she was reading his letters in Boston. She understood now why he'd been looking for someone. Not for company, though she suspected that had been part of it in ways he'd never admit. He needed another set of eyes, another pair of hands, another mind-running calculations beside his. She was trying to become that. The problem was that trying and succeeding were still separated by a significant gap, and the gap showed itself at the worst possible times. The first real argument happened on a Wednesday in early February. It started over the bread, which was not in itself about the bread. Evelyn had been experimenting. She'd found a note in Clara's last letter about a method for keeping bread from going stale too quickly, involving a different ratio of water to flour and a longer rise time. She'd tried it that morning while Thaddeus was out checking the east fence. It hadn't worked. The loaf had come out dense and gummy in the center, and she'd known by the look of it that it wasn't right, but they were running low on flour, and she'd made the calculation, wrong, as it turned out, that it was better than wasting the flour entirely by starting over. Thaddeus came in for the midday meal, looked at the bread, and cut into it. He didn't say anything immediately. He ate what he'd cut and set the rest aside. "What happened?" he asked. Not unkindly, just directly. "I was trying a different method," she said. "It didn't work as well as I'd hoped. We've got maybe 12 pounds of flour left until the next supply run." "I know, I misjudged." He pushed the bread aside and ate the rest of his meal without commenting further, but there was something in his silence that got under her skin in a way she hadn't expected. Not because he was being cruel. He wasn't. Because she'd been careful about the flour, she'd thought about it, and she'd still gotten it wrong, and his silence felt like a ledger being updated. "You could say it," she said, when he got up to go back out. He stopped. "Say what?" "Whatever you're thinking." He turned around. He looked tired. The February light made everyone look tired, she'd noticed, that flat gray pressing on everything. And he also looked like a man choosing his words with more care than usual. "I'm thinking we're tight on flour," he said, "and I'm thinking you should ask me before you try something new with supplies we can't easily replace." "You're right," she said, "that's all." "But there's something else you're thinking." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that you're smart enough to know better, and that worries me more than if you'd just made a mistake from not knowing." She felt that land somewhere uncomfortable, because he was right. She had known the risk, and she'd proceeded anyway, partly because she'd been certain enough in her own judgment, and partly, she could be honest with herself about this, because she'd wanted to prove she could develop the recipe on her own without asking him. "That's fair," she said. "I'm not trying to—" he started. "No, it's fair." She met his eyes. "I'll ask first." He nodded once and went back outside. She stood in the cabin for a minute after he left, not moving. The bad loaf of bread sat on the table looking exactly like what it was. Evidence of a miscalculation made by someone who was still learning that confidence and competence were not the same thing. She wrapped it up. They'd eat it anyway. She'd make sure it didn't happen with flour again. But the exchange had opened something that didn't close itself back up immediately. She found herself that afternoon, while she was mending a split in one of the horse blankets, turning over what he'd said. Smart enough to know better. There was something in that went both ways, she thought. It was a form of respect, even as it was a criticism. He wasn't treating her like someone who needed to be handled carefully. He was treating her like someone who was capable of more than she'd delivered. She decided to take it that way. It was better than the alternative. That evening, after dinner, she said, "Tell me about the drainage problem." He looked up from his book. "The North 40, she said. "You've mentioned it 3 times since I arrived, and I don't actually understand what the problem is. Explain it to me like I don't know anything about it, because I don't." He set the book down. He pulled the table toward him slightly, and then, surprising her, got up and found a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and sketched a rough map of the property. She moved her chair around to his side of the table so she could see it properly. He explained. It took almost an hour. The problem was more complicated than she'd understood. A combination of natural slope, soil composition in that section, and runoff from the higher ground to the north that overwhelmed the land's capacity to absorb moisture during the spring melt. It had been borderline manageable the first 2 years he'd owned the property, but 3 wet springs in a row had compounded the issue. Until now, a significant portion of what should have been productive planting ground was essentially useless for 3 or 4 months of the year. What would fix it, she asked. Drainage tiles, laid in channels under the soil, lets the water move through instead of sitting. He tapped the sketch. About 40 rods of tiling, I figure, maybe more. What does that cost? He told her. She was quiet for a moment. That's more than the farm earns in a good year. Just about. So it's not a question of knowing what to do. Never was, he said. It's a question of getting to a point where I can afford to do it, which requires the rest of the farm to produce well enough that I can put money by, which is harder when 1/5 of my planting ground is wet half the year. He looked at the sketch. It's circular. There has to be a way to break the circle somewhere. I've been trying to figure that for 3 years. She studied the sketch. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know enough yet. But she was already running the problem in her mind, the way she used to run arithmetic for the children she'd tutored, looking for the place where a different approach might make the same numbers come out differently. Let me think about it, she said. He looked at her. Not dismissively. He'd stopped doing that, she thought, sometime in January, but with the careful look of a man who's been disappointed enough to be cautious about expectation. All right, he said. She moved her chair back to her side of the table. He picked up his book. She picked up the mending she'd set aside. Outside, the February wind was doing what it did. Inside, the lamp burned steadily between them. March came and the cold didn't break so much as it loosened its grip in stages, reluctantly, like something that had been clenching too long. The days got longer. The light changed character. It was still thin, still pale, but it lasted a little further into the evening and started a little earlier in the morning, and that difference, small as it was, changed everything about how the days felt. Evelyn noticed she was tired in a different way. The grinding exhaustion of January and February, the kind that came from cold and darkness as much as from work, was shifting into something cleaner. She was tired because she was doing more, not because the elements were simply wearing her down. She had also, she realized one morning while she was hauling water, stopped calculating how many days she'd been there. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd stopped. Somewhere in February. The days had just become days, each one with its own particular list of requirements, and she'd stopped keeping a running count in her head of how long she'd been away from Boston, and how long it might be before what exactly she was no longer certain. Thaddeus, for his part, had begun explaining things without being asked, not constantly. He wasn't a man who narrated his work, but she'd notice him pause during a task and turn to include her in what he was doing. Not teaching her exactly, more like thinking out loud in her direction and trusting her to follow. When he was checking Duchess for signs of the reduced appetite that had worried him in December, he'd say what he was looking at and why. When he was assessing the east fence line, he'd explain why certain posts needed replacement now versus which ones could wait another season. She absorbed all of it. She asked questions when she didn't understand and didn't ask them when she did. Because she'd noticed that the quality of his explanations got better when he could see she was tracking rather than just listening politely. One Saturday in mid-March, a neighbor came by. His name was Bert Greer, mid-50s, big-framed, with the specific kind of permanent squint that comes from decades of working outdoors in this latitude. He ran the largest cattle operation adjacent to Thaddeus's property, which made him simultaneously the closest thing they had to a neighbor, and the source of the wandering cattle that tested their east fence monthly. He came in a wagon, which he pulled up to the cabin, and he sat up on the seat with his arms folded across his chest and waited for Thaddeus to come out. He didn't get down. Evelyn was in the yard splitting kindling when she heard the wagon and straightened up. Greer looked at her with the same squint he probably used on everything: terrain, weather, livestock. "You'd be the mail-order wife," he said. "Not cruel, just stating it." "I'd be Evelyn Hale," she said. She hadn't actually taken the name legally yet. That would wait until spring and a trip to Bozeman, but she said it anyway. It came out steadier than she'd expected. Greer appeared to weigh this. "Heard Thad finally sent for somebody." "News travels," she said pleasantly. "Everything travels in this valley. Nothing else to do." He looked toward the barn. "He in there?" "I'll get him." Thaddeus came out and they talked about a fence line, about some cattle that Greer's outfit had recovered that might have originally been part of a small herd passing through from further south, about whether the creek that ran the boundary between their properties was going to flood again this spring, the way it had the previous 2 years. It was the conversation of men who'd been neighbors long enough to have shared problems without being friends exactly. Evelyn went back to the kindling. She could hear them talking, and she didn't try to follow it, but she noticed the way Thaddeus stood when he was talking to Greer. Slightly different from how he stood when he was working or when he was in the cabin with her. More formal. Older, somehow, like he was aware of being seen. When Greer left, Thaddeus stood watching the wagon go for a minute before he came back toward the cabin. "He's all right," he said, as though she'd asked. "Nosy, but fair. Is that a meaningful distinction around here?" "Very," he said. "Most people are one or the other." She set down the axe. "He called me the mail-order wife." "Sorry." He said it without flinching from it, which she appreciated. I corrected him. He looked at her. "How?" "I told him I was Evelyn Hale." She picked up an armload of the split wood. "I don't know if that's what you want." I hadn't asked, but it came out before I'd decided. He was quiet for a moment, and she couldn't quite read his expression from this angle. Then, "It's fine," he said. "It's what you are." She carried the wood to the stack against the cabin wall. He went back to whatever he'd been doing before Greer had arrived. Neither of them said anything more about it. But she noticed that evening, when he came in for dinner, he set his hat on the peg and looked at the table she'd set and said, "Smells good." Which it probably did. She'd managed the salt pork in a way she was actually satisfied with, but which he said in a tone that was less about the food and more about the general fact of coming in at the end of the day to something prepared. She thought, Evelyn Hale. It fit differently than Whitlock had. Less like a label she'd inherited. More like something that was going to have to be earned. April announced itself with mud. The snow that had been accumulating since November began its slow surrender to the lengthening days, and the ground, which had been frozen solid beneath the snowpack, revealed itself in stages as something that was not yet ready to be walked on, worked on, or trusted. The yard became a problem. The path between the cabin and the barn became a study in commitment. You couldn't cross it without committing to it, because halfway across you were deep enough in the mud that retreating was just as expensive as going forward. They got through it by developing a rhythm. Planks laid from the cabin door to the pump. A different route to the barn that skirted the worst of it. Extra time built into every morning because every morning the mud had done something different overnight. Evelyn had asked in March if she could take over the accounts. Not manage the money. She wasn't suggesting that, but maintain the ledger, which Thaddeus had been keeping in a notebook that he updated irregularly and which she'd noticed when he'd shown her the books to explain the farm's financial situation was full of crossed-out figures and notes that referenced events she couldn't decode. He'd looked at her with the careful look. "You know accounting?" "I know figures," she said. "My father kept accounts. I used to help him before." She paused. "For a while. I'm good with numbers." He'd handed her the notebook without further discussion, which was, she was learning, his way of saying yes. The accounts were worse than she'd understood from the brief overview he'd given her in February. Not disastrously worse. There was no debt that threatened to swallow everything, but thin. The margins were thin. A bad harvest, an animal lost, a piece of equipment failed beyond repair, and the thinness would become crisis. The drainage problem on the North 40 wasn't just a farming inconvenience. It was a constraint that kept the entire operation from getting enough traction to build any real cushion. She spent 3 evenings with the notebook, rewriting it in her cleaner hand, organizing it forward and backward, looking at what came in and what went out and where the patterns were. On the fourth evening, she showed Thaddeus what she'd found. Here, she said, sliding the notebook across the table. Look at what we spend on flour and staples per month versus what we'd spend if we bought in larger quantities less often. The per unit price at Bozeman drops when you buy a full barrel rather than 25 pounds at a time. The difference over a year is, she pointed to the figure she'd calculated. He looked at it. I know, he said. The problem is I don't usually have the money to buy a barrel at once. But what if we waited one more month this time, kept what we'd have spent on the 25-pound purchase, and went to Bozeman with what we'd saved plus that month's? He looked at where her finger was pointing. He was quiet for a minute. That could work, he said. This spring, maybe. And here, she turned the page. The seeds. You've been buying from the general store in Bozeman, but there's a seed merchant in Helena that 3 other farms in the valley use, according to what Greer said when he was here. The prices are lower by about a quarter. I didn't know that. Greer mentioned it when you went to check the fence line. He wasn't talking to me specifically, just talking, but I remembered it. Thaddeus looked at the notebook for a long moment. He was thinking. She could tell from the particular quality of his stillness, the way his jaw worked slightly. You have a good memory, he said. I do, she said, without false modesty, because he'd told her early on that honesty was the most useful thing on this farm, and she'd taken it seriously. You could have told me about the Helena merchant earlier. I didn't know it was relevant until I looked at the accounts and saw what you were spending. He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, or rather, hadn't seen at this particular intensity. Not just the assessing look, not just the careful acknowledgement. Something that was starting to look like genuine regard, like a man revising a picture he'd been carrying and finding the new picture more accurate and more interesting than the old one. What do you want to do with the North 40? He asked. You said in February you'd think about it. I've been thinking about it. She turned to the back pages of the notebook where she'd made her own notes. What if we don't try to solve the drainage this year? We can't afford it. But what if we use the wet sections deliberately? Let them flood in the spring, plant later in the season with crops that can handle that kind of soil, and focus all the improvement work on the sections that are already productive. Get those producing as much as they can, build the cushion, and in 2 or 3 years, approach the drainage problem with actual money instead of no money, he said. Yes. He was looking at her notes. It's not perfect, she said. We lose the best planting window on that section every year we wait. We lose it now anyway, he said. At least this way we're choosing it. He sat back. He looked at the notebook and then at her. You're smarter about this than I expected, he said. Is that a surprise? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Yes, he said. I knew you were intelligent, but I didn't know you could. He gestured at the notebook. Think about a farm. I've been learning your farm for 4 months, she said. I pay attention. I've noticed, he said, and then quietly. I should have noticed sooner. It was in its way an apology. Not for anything specific, more for the general category of having underestimated her. She received it the same way she'd received the Christmas soap, quietly, without making more of it than it was, and with a note taken somewhere internal about the kind of man who offered that kind of accounting without being pushed to it. Come. May brought planting season, which brought a quality of work that was different from anything the winter had required. Winter work was about maintenance and survival. Planting was about intention, about putting something in the ground and betting on a future that didn't exist yet. Thaddeus worked from before dawn to after dark, and Evelyn worked alongside him. She drove the team now. Not expertly. Sampson still tested her when he felt like it, and there had been one memorable afternoon when she'd overcorrected on a turn and wedged the plow at an angle that had required both of them and 20 minutes to sort out. But she drove the team, and the rows she turned were straight enough to plant. And at the end of a long day behind the horses, her arms ached in a way that felt like accomplishment rather than punishment. You're getting strong, Thaddeus said one evening when she was washing up at the pump. She looked at her hands. The blisters had long since become calluses. The calluses had stopped surprising her. I didn't think I would, she said. Get actually strong. I thought I'd just manage. There's a difference? Managing is getting through it. Strong is... She tried to find the word. Starting to win. He looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she'd cataloged. Then he picked up the feed buckets and went to the barn. She dried her hands on her apron and looked at the sky above the Gallatin Valley, which in May turned a specific shade of blue in the late afternoon that she hadn't seen anywhere else. Wide and deep and indifferent, the way Montana was always indifferent. It didn't care whether you thrived or failed, it just kept going regardless. But she was starting to feel, standing in the yard with her calloused hands and her aching arms and the smell of turned earth in her clothes, that she might be getting somewhere. Not arrived, not finished learning, not without mistakes still waiting to happen, but somewhere. Somewhere that was beginning, slowly and without ceremony, to feel like hers. The first harvest came in September, and it was not what either of them had hoped for. It was not a disaster. Thaddeus had been careful about that from the beginning. He'd planted conservatively on the good sections, had not overextended on the wet acreage the way a less experienced farmer might have in a dry spring, had held back seed the way a man holds back something he can't afford to lose. So when the yield came in, it was enough. Barely, but enough. The corn was good on the upper section. The wheat was thinner than the previous year because of a dry stretch in July that had come right at the wrong time, and the vegetable garden, which Evelyn had taken full responsibility for in May, had produced more than she'd expected, partly because she'd talked to the wife of a farmer named Halverson at the Bozeman supply store and gotten advice about what grew well in this particular valley's specific combination of altitude and soil. The Halverson conversation had led to other conversations. This was something Thaddeus hadn't anticipated and which took him time to adjust to. Evelyn talked to people, not in the way of someone who needed conversation for its own sake, but in the way of someone who understood that other people were information. She asked questions, not intrusive ones, practical ones, and she listened to the answers with the same focused attention she gave to everything else. And then she came home with things he could use. Mrs. Halverson says the potato variety her family plants is a different strain than what the general store sells, she reported one evening in early summer. Seeds from a family that came through from the Oregon Territory. She'd share starts in the spring if we wanted. The Halverson place is a good farm, he said. I noticed. She also told me that 2 families in the valley have been losing chickens to something. Not fox, she thinks, because it's in the middle of the day. Hawk, Thaddeus said immediately. That's what I told her. He looked up from where he'd been sharpening a blade. You told her. I said I'd heard it was usually a hawk when the losses were midday, and that covering the run with wire at the top helped. She seemed to think that was useful. Evelyn didn't say it in a self-satisfied way. Just factual. She'd had information, and she'd shared it. Thaddeus set down the whetstone. You've learned more about farming in 7 months than some people manage in years, he said. I've had a patient teacher. I'm not patient. You've never once told me I was doing something wrong without also showing me the right way, she said. That's patience. You might not experience it that way, but it is. He picked up the whetstone again. He didn't argue it, which she was starting to recognize as the way he accepted a thing he didn't know how to respond to. The harvest took 3 weeks. They worked alongside each other every day in the way they developed over the summer, not in lockstep, not with constant communication, but with the particular efficiency of 2 people who'd learned each other's rhythms well enough to move in the same space without collision. She knew when he needed her to take over on something so he could move to the next task. He knew when she was working through a problem and needed to be left alone with it rather than helped. They communicated in the shorthand of people who'd spent enough days in close quarters that language had stopped being the primary mode. It was not until the harvest was in and the numbers were added up that they sat down together with the ledger and understood the full picture. We're ahead of last year, Thaddeus said. By about 12%, Evelyn confirmed. She had the figures in front of her. Not as much as I'd hoped. The wheat pulled the average down. The dry July wasn't in anybody's plans. No. She looked at the bottom figure. But we can make the bulk purchase in Bozeman this fall. And she turned to her notes in the back of the ledger. If we hold back this amount and add it to what we save over winter, by spring we could approach the drainage project on the North 40. Not the whole 40 rods, maybe half. He looked at the figure she was pointing to. He was quiet. Half is better than 0, she said. Half might be enough to make that section workable in a wet year, he said slowly. If we combined it with... He took the pencil from her and made a note in the margin. There's a technique I read about in one of the agricultural reports. Raising the planting bed slightly in the problem section so the roots sit above the worst of the moisture. Takes more labor, but not more money. She looked at his note. Where did you read about that? Periodical I borrowed from Greer. He gets the Montana Agricultural Bulletin. Can we borrow it again? I want to read the whole article. He looked at her. You want to read an agricultural bulletin? I want to understand what we're doing, she said simply. I can't make useful suggestions if I only half understand the problem. He held her gaze for a moment, then he said, I'll ask Greer. The bulletin arrived 2 weeks later with Greer himself, who had apparently decided this was worth a personal delivery. He sat in the yard on the bench Thaddeus had built against the south wall of the cabin, a recent addition built in July on a Sunday when the light was good and the work that needed doing could wait an hour, and drank coffee while Evelyn asked him questions about his drainage approach on the low sections of his property. Greer answered. He was the kind of man who became more generous with information when he could see it was being taken seriously, and Evelyn took it seriously, asking specific follow-up questions that showed she'd already thought about the problem before he arrived. He looked at Thaddeus once, midway through the conversation, with an expression that Thaddeus recognized as reassessment. When Greer left, he shook Thaddeus's hand and then, in a way that was particular to this valley, to men of his generation who didn't make gestures unnecessarily, he nodded at Evelyn. Not a social nod, an acknowledging nod, the kind you gave to someone you'd decided was worth taking seriously. Your wife's got a good head, he said to Thaddeus, in the way of men who offer compliments indirectly, so they can't be accused of softness. I know, Thaddeus said. Greer climbed back into his wagon and drove away. Thaddeus turned to find Evelyn watching the wagon go with an expression he couldn't entirely read. All right? He asked. He called me your wife again, she said. You are my wife. I know, it just... She paused. It still sounds like someone else's sentence. She turned back toward the cabin. I'll get used to it. He watched her go in, and then stood in the yard for a moment in the September afternoon light, which was the best light of the year in this valley, long and golden and completely without urgency, thinking about the sentence she'd said. It still sounds like someone else's sentence. He understood that. There were still moments when he thought of his own name, and it sounded like something from another man's life. Thaddeus Hale, landowner, farmer, husband. A list of nouns that were technically accurate and somehow still settling into permanent shape. He went inside. She was at the stove. He sat down at the table with the agricultural bulletin and started reading the article about raised planting beds. After a while, he read a passage out loud to her. She turned from the stove and listened without speaking until he was done. Read that last part again, she said. He did. That's what we should do, she said. Yes, he said. I think so too. October was when the signs started, not signs that anyone would have identified immediately as the beginning of something serious, more like the accumulation of small indicators that Thaddeus, who had 5 years in this valley and had learned to read its moods, began watching with a particular quality of attention. The way the geese came through earlier than usual in the last week of September. The way the aspens up on the higher slopes had turned and dropped their leaves by mid-October, when they usually held until the end of the month. The behavior of the cattle on the Greer spread, visible across the fence line from Thaddeus's east pasture, bunching together and moving close to the windbreaks in a way they did when their bodies were telling them something the calendar wasn't showing yet. It's going to be a bad winter, he said one evening in mid-October, not to Evelyn specifically, more to the room or to himself. She looked up from the ledger. How bad? Don't know yet, but early. And cold. He was standing at the window, looking at the sky in the south, which had a color to it in the late afternoon. A specific metallic quality, silver gray with a hard edge, that he'd seen before. We should think about whether we've got enough put by. They spent 2 evenings going through everything. The root cellar was better stocked than any previous year. Evelyn had been meticulous about it, had researched preservation methods through the agricultural bulletin and through conversations with women at the Bozeman market, had put up more vegetables and more preserved meat than Thaddeus had thought strictly necessary and which he was now reconsidering. The barn was tight, which was something he'd prioritized over the summer when there was time, the roof repair was done finally, completed in July in 2 hard days of work they'd done together, with Evelyn on the ground handing up materials and managing the ropes while he worked on the slope. The wood supply was well ahead of where it had been the previous October. Duchess was the concern. She was in the later stages of pregnancy. Due sometime in December, which was earlier than ideal but not, Thaddeus had said, unusual for a cow of her age and breeding. She was healthy, eating well, moving normally. But the timing, combined with his increasing certainty that the winter coming was going to be the hard kind, had him running calculations that didn't give comfortable answers. If she has trouble, Evelyn said one evening when they'd been discussing it, then it's trouble, he said. That's all I can say about it. What kind of trouble can happen? He told her. He was direct about it, the way he'd learned to be with her when she asked direct questions. She didn't want softened versions, and softened versions weren't useful anyway. A difficult labor. A calf that came wrong. A cow that lost the calf and went into decline. The complications that could come from cold temperatures during a delivery if the barn wasn't warm enough. He dealt with all of these in his years on the farm and on the cattle operation before it. He'd lost animals. It was a part of this life that you couldn't make clean or comfortable, and Evelyn had been here long enough that he trusted her to hear it without flinching. She didn't flinch. Tell me what I need to know to help, she said. He told her that too. November brought the first hard cold, and Thaddeus's read on the winter proved itself accurate within the first 2 weeks. The temperature dropped 20 degrees below the seasonal average and stayed there. The snow began in mid-November and was serious from the start. Not the tentative early snow of a normal year, but purposeful, heavy accumulations that built quickly and stayed. The work of keeping the farm running in those conditions doubled. Water for the animals had to be hauled more often because the pump froze despite the insulation they'd packed around it, and they had to develop a system. Specific times of day when someone broke the ice and hauled before it froze back. The barn had to be checked more frequently for drafts that the previous owner's construction hadn't accounted for and which Thaddeus had identified in the fall and partially addressed. Duchess needed more feed to maintain her condition through the cold and the demands of her pregnancy. Evelyn did all of it. Not all of it alone. They worked together, but she took on the tasks that freed Thaddeus for the heavier physical work. And she did them without complaint and without, as far as he could tell, the kind of quiet resentment he'd have understood if she'd developed it. She'd become, over the course of a year, someone who worked because the work needed doing, not because she was being watched. There was one afternoon in late November, a Wednesday, the temperature at 11 below and falling. When he came in from a long session of fence repair he'd been doing against time, because a section of the north fence had to be fixed before the next snowfall buried the posts entirely. And he came in cold enough that his fingers weren't working properly, and there was ice in his beard, and he was thinking about nothing except warmth and something to eat. Evelyn was at the stove. On the table was a plate covered with a cloth, his dinner, kept warm. The water for washing was already heated and sitting in the basin. She'd been watching out the window, he realized. She'd timed it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. Go wash first, she said, not turning from the stove. You'll feel better. He washed. He sat down. She set a bowl of bean soup in front of him that was, he realized as he started eating, the best thing she'd cooked yet. Not complicated, but timed and seasoned correctly, and hot in a way that addressed the specific cold that had gotten into him on the fence line. This is good, he said. Mrs. Halverson's method, she said. I've been working on it. He ate. She sat across from him with her own bowl. They were quiet in the way they often were at the end of long, cold days. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said enough today and were comfortable with not saying more. After a while, she said, Duchess was restless this morning. He looked up. Not the same as yesterday, she said. Different restless. She kept shifting her weight. She wouldn't settle. He was already calculating. How long? About an hour before she calmed down. She ate well at the midday feed, but that restlessness this morning, Evelyn paused. I don't know how to read it yet, but you said she'd show signs in her movement. He got up and put on his coat. Stay and eat, she said. I'll come with you. They went out to the barn together, the cold hitting like something physical when they cleared the cabin door. He carried the lamp. The snow was packed hard underfoot, and the sky above the Gallatin Valley was the specific black of a winter night in this country. Not gentle, not beautiful from here, just enormous and cold and absolute. Duchess was standing in the back of her stall. She turned her head when they came in, and Thaddeus set the lamp on the hook and went to her and ran his hands along her flank and her back and crouched down and looked at what he needed to look at. He stood up. "She's not going tonight," he said. "Could be a week, could be less. But Evelyn," he turned to her, "you were right to notice that restlessness is real. We need to start checking her through the night." She nodded. No drama about it, just nodded, adjusting to the new information. "I'll take the first check," she said. "You've been out all afternoon. Sleep first." He looked at her. The lamplight in the barn was the warm yellow kind that softened everything, and she was standing in her coat with her hands in her pockets, and her dark hair coming loose from its pins the way it always did by evening. And she looked, he thought, not for the first time in recent months, like someone who had grown into this place in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted from the woman who'd climbed off that train 14 months ago in a Boston dress with an enormous trunk and an expression that was trying very hard not to show how scared she was. "Wake me at 2, he said. "I will." He went back to the cabin. She stayed for another few minutes with Duchess, talking to the cow in a low voice, the kind of quiet nonsense talk that animals seem to settle with. And then she came in and they went to their respective bunks, and the cabin was quiet. She did wake him at 2. She'd checked Duchess twice by then. No change. He took the next watch and she slept, and they traded off through the night the way they'd learned to trade off difficult things, without making a negotiation of it, without one of them having to ask. December arrived, and with it the kind of cold that is its own argument against the possibility of warmth ever having existed. The temperature in the first week of December dropped to -28 and stayed near there for 4 consecutive days. The Gallatin Valley, which Thaddeus had once described to Evelyn as rough but beautiful in its way, was in those days simply brutal. The beauty was not visible. The beauty was buried under 3 feet of compacted snow, with more coming, under a sky the color of old iron, under a cold that made every task 3 times as difficult, and left no margin for anything to go wrong. On the 8th day of December, a Thursday, Duchess went into labor. Evelyn knew it before Thaddeus did. She'd been doing the first barn check of the morning. Still dark, 5:30, the thermometer on the barn wall reading -23, and she went in with the lamp and saw the change in Duchess immediately. Not the restlessness she'd been monitoring for 2 weeks, something more committed than that, something that said this is happening now. She went back to the cabin at a run. "Thaddeus." She didn't knock or hesitate. She'd stopped hesitating about things that were urgent. "It's time." He was up before she finished saying it. They went to the barn together, and from that point the night stopped being something they were moving through and became something they were in. Thaddeus worked. That was the only way to put it. He worked with his hands and his knowledge and the focused calm of someone who'd done difficult things enough times to have learned that panic costs more than it's worth. The labor was hard. Duchess was a big animal, and she was struggling, and the calf was not positioned as well as it should have been. And the cold in the barn, despite everything they'd done, was still severe enough that time mattered, because a calf born into that temperature had a narrow window. Evelyn held the lamp. That was her task, and she did it without moving from the spot he'd pointed her to. Steady, at the angle he needed, high enough to give him light on the work and not in his way. She held it with both hands because her arms were tiring and she was not going to let them tire. She could feel the cold in her feet and her back and her face, the creeping specific cold of standing still in a freezing barn, but her hands stayed steady. Duchess labored and struggled, and Thaddeus spoke to her in a low, constant voice. Not commanding, just present, just, "I'm here, stay with me, keep working." And worked with a care and a concentration that Evelyn watched with something she couldn't have put a clean name to, a quality of attention that was more than respect. At some point, she didn't know how long they'd been there, time had become unmeasurable in the barn. Her hands went numb. Not the surface numbness of ordinary cold, the kind of numbness that sends a message. The hands are no longer certain of what they're holding. She did not put the lamp down. She gripped it harder. She could feel the metal handle through the numbness as a pressure rather than a sensation, and she shifted her grip slightly to redistribute the weight, and she held it. "You all right?" Thaddeus asked, without looking up from his work. Yes, she said. He worked for another 20 minutes. She held the lamp. When the calf came, when it finally came, front legs first, and then the rest of it in a rush that made Duchess groan with what sounded like relief. Thaddeus caught it and worked fast with the straw and the rough toweling he'd brought, clearing the nose and mouth, working life into the little animal with his hands. And the calf made a sound, and Duchess turned and found it, and it was alive. Evelyn set the lamp down on the hook she'd had in her sight for the past hour and a half and looked at her hands. They were white, not pale. White, and she couldn't feel them at all. She pressed them under her arms, inside her coat, and stood breathing. Thaddeus stood up. He looked at Duchess, who was cleaning her calf with a heavy, exhausted purpose. He looked at the calf. He stood there for a moment with his back to Evelyn, and she could see from his posture alone that something had let go in him. Something wound tight for hours, or maybe weeks, that was only now releasing. He turned around. He looked at her face first and then at her arms crossed over her chest. His expression changed. Your hands, he said. They'll come back, she said. I've been working them. He crossed the barn in 3 steps and took both her hands out from under her arms and held them in his, which were warm from the work. And he rubbed them between his palms in the focused way he did everything. Not gentle, exactly, but thorough, like there was a right way to do this and he was going to do it right. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The calf moved in the straw behind them, finding its legs for the first time. Duchess made a low sound. After a while, feeling began to come back into Evelyn's hands, the unpleasant prickling return of circulation, and she winced slightly. Good sign, he said. Means they're coming back. I know, she said. You told me. Did I? Last month, when we were talking about what to watch for in cold weather. She flexed her fingers carefully. I remember things. He was still holding her hands. Neither of them had moved. The lamplight in the barn was the same warm yellow as always. The smell of hay and animal and cold air around them, the calf making small, uncertain sounds in the straw. Why didn't you say something? He asked. About your hands. You needed the light where it was. Evelyn, the calf needed to be born alive, she said. Not arguing, just stating it. We needed it to be born alive. Moving the light was going to make that harder, so I didn't move the light. He looked at her for a moment. His face in the lamplight was... She'd learned to read it over 14 months, better than she'd been able to read anything in a long time. And what she read there now was something that was past gratitude, past acknowledgement, past the careful regard she'd been watching grow in him over the course of a year. It was something simpler than all of those, and more significant. Thank you, he said. His voice was rough from the cold and the hours of low talking, and it came out plain and direct the way things came out of him when he wasn't thinking about how they sounded. She looked at their hands, his large ones around her smaller ones, and then at him. We saved her, she said. We did, he said. They stayed like that for another minute, in the cold barn with the new calf and the exhausted cow and the lamp burning steadily on the hook where she'd placed it. Outside, the Gallatin Valley was as cold as it had ever been. The wind pressed against the barn walls. The thermometer read -23 and would read less than that before morning. Inside, it was warm enough. They named the calf Clara. Evelyn suggested it the morning after the birth, when they were both back in the barn doing the first feed and watching the little animal, who had made it through the night, which had been the first real test, and had passed it with the stubborn vitality of something that had decided to survive, navigate the stall on legs that were still figuring out their job. Clara, Thaddeus said. He tried it out like a man testing the weight of something. After your sister. She wrote me a letter last month asking how the cow was doing, Evelyn said. She worries about Duchess like she's a person. It seems right. He looked at the calf. Clara, he said again. Then, all right. It was a small thing, but Evelyn noticed it the way she'd learned to notice the small things he did. The way he'd said all right like the name was now settled fact, like it had been entered into some internal ledger and closed. Thaddeus Hale did not go back on things once he'd accepted them. It was one of the qualities she'd come to rely on, this solidity of his, even when it made him inflexible in ways that were occasionally frustrating. Her hands had recovered fully by the following morning. Some tenderness in the fingertips for 2 days, a slight stiffness in the cold, and then they were her hands again, calloused and capable, and she went back to using them without ceremony. Thaddeus watched her hands for a week. She pretended not to notice because noticing would have made him stop, and she didn't want him to stop. There was something in his attention that she'd stopped trying to categorize and had simply started accepting, the way you accept weather, not as something you'd chosen, but as something real and present that affected the temperature of every day. The hard winter continued through January. They moved through it the way they'd moved through the previous one, but differently, with a year of shared knowledge between them, with a shorthand that made the work faster and the days less isolating. The cabin was the same size it had always been. Somehow, it had gotten larger, in the way that a space expands when the people in it have stopped being strangers. It was in those weeks, in the gray middle of the winter after the barn night, that certain things which had been moving slowly between them stopped moving slowly. It didn't happen the way it happens in stories, not with a declaration or a dramatic moment that announced itself as significant. It happened the way most real things happen, which is gradually and then all at once, and then in a way that makes you wonder how it hadn't happened sooner. It started, as things between them often did, with a conversation that began as something practical. He'd come in late one January evening from patching a section of the south wall that the wind had found a weakness in, and she'd been at the table writing a letter to Clara, and he'd sat down across from her to warm up before bed and had not immediately gone to his bunk, which had been his habit. He'd sat there and looked at her writing and then said, out of nowhere, "Do you miss it?" She kept her pen moving. "Miss what specifically?" "Boston, the life you had." She finished the sentence she was on before she looked up. "I miss Clara," she said. "I miss certain conversations I used to have with people who," she thought about how to say it honestly, "people who read things, thought about things. I miss that more at first than I do now." "Why less now?" She looked at him directly. "Because I have that here." He didn't say anything. He turned his cup in his hands. "You've read 4 books in the past 2 months," she said. "You asked me last week what I thought about the argument that author was making about land rights. We talked about it for an hour." She paused. "I didn't expect that when I came here. It wasn't in the advertisement." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. He was sparing with those, but adjacent. "What did you expect?" he asked. "A transaction," she said. "Honestly, someone who needed labor and would take what I could provide and leave the rest of me somewhere separate." She set the pen down. "That's not what happened." He was looking at her in the particular way, the one she'd cataloged and stopped analyzing because analysis wasn't what it required anymore. "What did happen?" he said. "It wasn't quite a question. You," she said, "read poetry to yourself at night, and then told me which parts sounded like things you'd thought but couldn't say. That happened." The silence that followed was different from their usual silences, more present, like something in the room had shifted its weight. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not—" He stopped. He tried again. "I don't know how to do this. I've been alone here a long time. I got used to it, and now I'm—" He pressed his mouth together. "Not used to it." "I know," she said again, softer. "I don't want you to—" He stopped again. "Thaddeus." She waited until he looked at her. "I came here to build a life. I didn't know if it was possible. I thought it might be a survivable mistake at best." She held his gaze steadily. "It isn't that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture from the barn, his large hand over her smaller one, but different this time. Deliberate. Not emergency and warmth, but something else that didn't need a name because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. She turned her hand under his and held on. They sat like that for a while, in the cabin that was too small and warm enough, while outside the January wind did what it did and the lamp burned down and Clara made small sounds in the barn 50 yards away. It was not a perfect moment. His hands were rough and she was tired, and the letter to Clara sat unfinished on the table. But it was true, which was better than perfect, and they both understood, without saying it, because some things don't require saying, that something had moved from one place to another and would not be moving back. February brought a thaw, brief and treacherous, followed by a refreeze that made the yard into a skating rink and broke 2 fence posts on the east line. They fixed the fence in the refreezing cold, working side by side in the particular misery of cold that's also wet. And when they came in, Evelyn made coffee, and Thaddeus built the fire back up, and they sat close together at the table in a way they now sat. Close, easy, not making anything of it because it didn't need to be made into something. She was writing to Clara more frequently now. The letters had changed character, less like reports, more like conversations. She told Clara about the drainage project they were planning for spring, about Clara the calf who was growing improbably fast, and had developed an opinion about the grain she was given. She told Clara about the agricultural bulletin that Greer had started setting aside for them specifically, apparently having decided they were worth the trouble. She did not tell Clara, not yet, about the January evening at the table, because some things needed to settle into permanence before you put them in a letter, and she wanted to be sure of what she was describing before she described it. She was, she thought, quite sure. But she was also a woman who'd been wrong before about the stability of situations she trusted, and she was not rushing anything. What she hadn't counted on was Clara, her sister, not the calf, deciding to rush it herself. A letter arrived in early March. Clara had somehow found Bert Greer's name. Evelyn had mentioned him as a neighbor, and written to him at his address, asking, with the directness of a woman who had spent years managing a household on a shopkeeper's income, whether her sister was all right. Greer had apparently answered the letter personally, which Evelyn would not have predicted, and had told Clara that her sister was doing well and improving the Hale property considerably, which was the most lavish compliment she'd ever heard attributed to him. Clara's return letter to Evelyn contained a single underlined sentence. He says Thaddeus Hale is a decent man who works hard and values what he has. Is that enough, Evie? I hope it's enough. Evelyn read the letter at the table while Thaddeus was in the barn, and then she sat there with it in her hands for a while. Is that enough? She thought about this question seriously, the way it deserved. She thought about the 12 lines in an advertisement and her 11 drafts of a response and a train journey across a country that got bigger the further west she went. She thought about a bad loaf of bread and a pair of mismatched work gloves. She thought about a hand over hers in the middle of a frozen barn, and the same hand across a table in January, and what the difference between those 2 moments meant. She thought about the fact that she'd come here with nothing and had over 14 months, built something she wouldn't trade for the life she'd left. Not because the life she'd left was bad, but because this one was hers in a way that nothing had been hers before. Earned in the specific currency of difficulty and attention, and choosing every day to stay and learn and work. When Thaddeus came in from the barn, she was still at the table. Letter from Clara? He asked, seeing it. She's been corresponding with Greer, Evelyn said. He stopped with his coat halfway off. About what? About me. She looked up. He told her I was improving the property considerably. Thaddeus finished taking his coat off. He hung it up. He came and looked over her shoulder at the letter, which he could read because she held it up for him. Greer's not wrong, he said. That's not the point. She put the letter down. My sister asked me in this letter whether what I have here is enough. He sat down across from her. He waited. I want to tell her yes, Evelyn said. I want to tell her yes with the same certainty I tell her other things I'm sure about. I want to write a sentence that doesn't have a qualification in it. She looked at him. Can I do that? The question sat on the table between them. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man avoiding something, but the silence of a man who takes questions seriously and means to answer them correctly. When you got off that train, he said, I looked at you and I thought, I've made a mistake. I thought, she can't do this. She doesn't know what this is. He turned his cup. I was wrong. Not just about whether you could do it, about what I was actually looking at. What were you actually looking at? Someone who was going to outlast the situation, he said. I just couldn't see it yet. He looked at her steadily. You can write your sister yes. Is that? She almost said enough and then didn't, because it was a better question than that. Is that what you mean it to be? It's what I mean it to be, he said. Yes. She picked up the pen. She wrote a letter to Clara that night that was 2 pages long and had no qualifications in it. Spring broke in April with the determination of something that had been held back too long. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the valley floor in patches, then from the yard, leaving behind the mud and the mess of winter's end that Evelyn now faced with the experience of someone who knew what was underneath it. The drainage project began in May. They had enough, not for the full 40 rods of tiling, but for half, and with the raised bed technique from the agricultural bulletin applied to the remaining problem sections, they had a plan that was going to change the North 40's contribution to the farm's yield in a way that the numbers supported even conservatively. Thaddeus had said as much at the table in April with the ledger open between them, and Evelyn had agreed, and they'd settled on a start date and a sequence of work, and that was that. What Thaddeus hadn't said, because he was not a man who narrated his own internal states, was that the plan itself was something he couldn't have arrived at alone. Not because he lacked the knowledge. He'd known about drainage tiles for years, had known the cost, had known the raised bed technique from the bulletin, but because the particular combination of approaches, the specific sequencing that made it financially possible this year rather than in some indefinite future, had come from an evening at the table with Evelyn's handwriting in the ledger margin and her finger on a figure he'd been looking at for months without seeing what she saw in it. He thought about this sometimes, not obsessively, but with a quality of genuine surprise that hadn't worn off. He'd spent 5 years on this land solving its problems with what he had, which was his own knowledge and his own labor and a kind of stubbornness that had kept him here through years that would have sent a different man back east. He had not known what it would mean to have someone else's mind working alongside his. It was different from hired labor, different from neighbors' occasional help. It was the difference between doing a calculation alone and having someone catch the error in your arithmetic before it compounds over years. He said some version of this to her one evening in May, when they were both tired from the first real week of drainage work, which was hard, physical, unglamorous work, the kind that left you with clay-caked boots and a back that needed a day to forgive you. And she looked at him with the particular expression she had when something he said landed differently than he'd intended. "You're describing partnership," she said. "I suppose I am." "You didn't expect it." "I expected someone to help run the house," he said. Honest, the way they'd been with each other since November of last year. Someone capable. I thought that was enough to hope for. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands, the calloused, capable hands that had changed more than any other physical thing about her in the past 16 months. "I didn't expect it either," she said. "I expected to be useful. I thought that was the best I could hope for." "And now?" She looked up. "Now I think I'd have been unhappy with just useful. I think I'd have done it, made myself useful, and been grateful it was enough. But it would have been a smaller life than this." She paused. "Smaller than what I actually wanted, which I didn't let myself know when I answered that advertisement, because wanting more seemed dangerous. Dangerous how? If you want something and you don't get it, that's one kind of loss. If you want something and you let yourself know you want it, and then don't get it." She made a small gesture. "I'd had enough of the second kind." He understood that in the specific way of someone who'd made the same calculation at some point and arrived at the same solution. Want less, protect more, keep the margin small. He'd been running that calculation for 5 years alone on this property. "The letters," he said. She looked at him. "We both kept something back," he said. "In the letters. I thought about that later. Why we both—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Curated. What we showed." "Same reason," she said. "What I told you. Wanting something and not being able to afford to know it." "Yes." He nodded slowly. Outside, the May evening was doing what May evenings did in this valley. A gradual softening of light that went on longer than you'd expect. A warmth that was still thin but present. The first real smell of earth and growing things after months of cold. The drainage work in the North 40 had already begun to show what it would do. The standing water that had been there since the snow melt was draining, slowly but visibly, into the channels they'd laid. "I'm glad we wrote the letters anyway," he said. She looked at him. "Even with what we left out," he said. "Even with the lies." He said the word plainly, without apology, because they'd both earned the right to call things what they were. Because the alternative was— He paused. "This doesn't happen any other way." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, it doesn't." They sat with that. The lamp on the table. The ledger open to the spring accounts, which were better than any previous spring. Clara, the calf, now 4 months old and managing opinions about most things, making sounds in the barn. "Thaddeus," she said. I'm going to write to Clara and ask if she'd like to visit in the summer." He looked at her. "Your sister. She's never been further west than Albany, and she's been running my life from Providence through correspondence since November." A pause. "I think she'd like to see it. It's a long trip. She's tougher than she looks. It runs in the family." Evelyn said it without particular emphasis, but she watched the side of his face and saw the small shift she'd learned to read. "Write to her," he said. She did. And while she wrote, Thaddeus got down from the shelf the battered poetry volume with the inscription from Margaret, which Evelyn had never asked about, because there were things that didn't need to be opened. And he sat with it for a while before he set it aside and instead picked up the agricultural bulletin with the article about raised beds that they'd read together enough times that the pages were soft with handling. He read it again, making a note in the margin in his blocky handwriting, and Evelyn finished her letter and read it over and then looked up and looked at him in the lamplight, at the man who had written 12 lines in an advertisement and meant something in them he hadn't known how to say, and thought, "This is what I came here for, and I didn't even know it." The North 40 was draining. The calf was growing. Outside, the Gallatin Valley was doing what it did in May, opening up, releasing what winter had held. And in the cabin that was still too small and still warm enough, two people who had both told the careful truth of what they needed without quite saying what they wanted had arrived 16 months and one hard winter later at the thing they'd wanted all along. Not through luck, not through things falling into place, through work and honesty and the specific choice, made over and over on bad days and good ones, to stay. Clara Whitlock arrived in Bozeman on a Tuesday in July, on the same line Evelyn had ridden 18 months before, and she stepped off the train looking at the mountains with the expression of someone whose understanding of the word large had just been permanently revised. Evelyn was waiting on the platform. She'd driven the wagon herself. Thaddeus had offered to come, but she'd wanted this first part to be just the two of them, sisters in a train station, before the introductions and the explanations and the business of showing Clara the life she'd built. They held each other on the platform for longer than either of them usually allowed for displays of feeling, which told Evelyn more about how worried Clara had been than any of the letters had. "You look different," Clara said, pulling back and looking at her properly. "I know." "Strong." Clara said it like she was still deciding whether it was the right word. "You look like you know where you are." Evelyn thought about that on the wagon ride back to the farm. 14 miles, same road, completely different direction of feeling from the one 18 months ago. Clara talked, which she did when she was nervous, asking questions and answering some of them herself before Evelyn could respond, and Evelyn let her because Clara's talking had always been a form of affection, a way of filling space around the people she loved, so they didn't feel alone in it. When the farm came into view, Clara went quiet. It was different from what Evelyn had seen that first November evening. Different not just in season, though July made everything different, the grass full and green, the garden beside the cabin visible from the road in a way it hadn't been under 3 feet of snow. It was different because of what they'd built and repaired and added in 18 months. The barn roof, solid now. The bench against the south wall of the cabin. The expanded chicken run with its wire top. The North 40, visible past the barn. Its previously waterlogged sections showing the geometry of the drainage channels they'd laid. The soil darker and worked where it had previously been pale and compacted and useless. "That's it," Evelyn said. Clara looked at it for a long moment. "It's small," she said. "It is. But it's—" Clara stopped. "It looks like someone takes care of it." "Someone does," Evelyn said. "Two of us." Thaddeus was in the yard when they pulled up, coming from the direction of the barn with his coat off in the July heat. And he looked at the wagon and then at Clara with the direct assessment that was his default and which Evelyn had learned to read as respect rather than judgment. He looked at people the way he looked at everything, trying to understand what he was actually dealing with. Clara looked back at him with an expression that Evelyn recognized, her sister running calculations. He shook Clara's hand and said he was glad she'd made the trip, and that was approximately the extent of his formal welcome, which was all he had in him for formal things, and then he took the wagon to the barn and left them to it. Clara watched him go. Then she turned to Evelyn. He doesn't say much. No. But he's... She paused. He looks at you a certain way. What way? Clara thought about it. Like you're part of his accounting, she said. Like you're in the column with the things that matter. Evelyn said nothing, but something in her chest settled at that. The way things settle when someone else sees accurately what you've been trying to articulate to yourself for months. Clara stayed 2 weeks. She spent the first 3 days in a state of careful adjustment. To the scale of everything, to the pace, to the particular quality of silence that the Gallatin Valley had at night, which was not the silence of absence, but the silence of a great deal of space being very quiet all at once. She helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't, which was the right instinct. And Evelyn watched her sister recalibrate her understanding of what a life could look like in real time. On the 4th day, Clara got up at first light without being asked and went to help with Duchess. Evelyn heard her go and lay in the bunk for a moment listening, and then got up and followed. Clara was in the barn, sitting on the stool, attempting to milk the cow with the careful inexperience of someone trying to replicate something she'd watched twice. Duchess was tolerating it with the patience of an animal who'd seen this before. Your grip is wrong, Evelyn said from the doorway. Clara looked up. I know, I can feel it's wrong. Show me. Evelyn showed her, crouching beside the stool exactly the way Thaddeus had crouched beside her, 16 months ago on a November morning when she'd been sitting in roughly the same dignified position Clara was in now. She showed her the grip, the rhythm, the angle. Clara tried it, got a better result. You learned this in how long? Clara asked. 2 weeks before it was decent. Another month before Duchess stopped being offended by me. Clara tried again. The milk came more steadily. Evie, she said after a minute. I was so worried about you. She kept her eyes on what she was doing. When you first wrote those early letters, you tried to make it sound manageable, but I could read the parts you were smoothing over. I know how you write when you're scared. I was scared, Evelyn said. For a while. When did that stop? Evelyn thought about it honestly. Gradually, she said. And then one morning I realized I'd stopped counting the days since Boston, and I understood something had shifted. What shifted? I stopped thinking of this as the thing I was surviving. She paused. Started thinking of it as the thing I was building. Clara was quiet for a moment. The barn was warm in the early morning, the July heat already present, and Clara the calf, now 7 months old and a substantial animal with definite opinions, was watching them from her section of the stall with an expression that bore an unsettling resemblance to curiosity. She's looking at me, Clara said. She does that. She was born in the worst night of the worst winter in years. Thaddeus spent 3 hours getting her into the world, and I held the lamp. Clara looked at the calf, then at her sister. You held a lamp in a barn in -20. My hands went numb. I didn't put it down. Why not? Because he needed the light where it was. Clara turned back to Duchess. She finished the milking, not perfectly, not even close to Evelyn's time, but adequately. And then she stood up and looked at her sister and said, Marry him properly. We are married. Make the trip to Bozeman. Do it with a witness and paperwork and the name in a proper record. Clara picked up the bucket. You've been Evelyn Hale in practice for over a year. Be Evelyn Hale on paper. It matters, Evie. It protects you. Evelyn opened the barn door for her. The July morning came in, gold and warm. I know, she said. We've been talking about it. Stop talking about it. Evelyn looked at her. Have you always been this direct and I just didn't notice? You noticed, Clara said. You just usually live far enough away that I can't follow up. They went to Bozeman on a Saturday in the 3rd week of July. Thaddeus and Evelyn in the wagon, Clara beside them, and Bert Greer, who had somehow become the closest thing they had to a family friend through the sheer force of his consistent presence in their lives, following in his own wagon because he'd been asked to witness and had agreed with the brevity of a man who considered the matter already settled. The courthouse in Bozeman was a wooden building that smelled of sawdust and ink, and the justice of the peace was a small man named Alderton, who had married a great number of frontier couples and had the brisk efficiency of someone who respected the institution without feeling the need to decorate it with ceremony. It took 11 minutes. At the end of those 11 minutes, Evelyn Constance Whitlock was entered in the Gallatin County record as Evelyn Constance Hale, and Thaddeus shook Alderton's hand, and Greer made the sound he made when he approved of something, a kind of compressed exhale. And Clara took Evelyn's hand and held it briefly and said nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. On the wagon ride back, the four of them were quiet in the comfortable way of people who've done something that required no elaboration. The valley opened around them in the summer afternoon. The mountains in the south were the particular blue they went in July, and the grass on the valley floor was tall and full, and Thaddeus drove with his usual economy of motion, and Evelyn sat beside him with her shoulder against his in the way they rode now, easy and habitual. "Evelyn Hale," Clara said from behind them. "That's been the case for some time," Evelyn said. "Now it's also a fact." Clara was quiet for a moment. "It suits you better than Whitlock did, if you want to know." Evelyn looked at the road ahead. "I know," she said. "I figured that out fairly early." Thaddeus said nothing, but she felt the slight shift in his shoulder against hers, and she knew what it meant the way she knew most things about him now, through proximity and attention and the accumulated data of shared days. Note: Clara left on a Thursday morning, and the goodbye on the Bozeman platform was harder than either of them had expected, which was also something that ran in the family. The Whitlock women were consistently surprised by their own feelings. "Come next summer," Evelyn said. "Try and stop me." Clara held her once more. "Write me more than once a month." "I'll try." "Don't try. Do it." Clara pulled back. She looked at Thaddeus, who was standing at the appropriate distance with the appropriate expression, which was to say he was giving them space and trying not to look like he was doing it deliberately. "Mr. Hale?" "Mrs. Bennett," he said, her married name, which he'd made a point of learning and using correctly. "Take care of her," Clara said. "She takes care of herself," he said. "Mostly, I try to keep up." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Good answer," and picked up her bag and got on the train. Evelyn stood on the platform until the train was out of sight. Then she turned around and walked back to where Thaddeus was waiting beside the wagon. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it. The years that followed were not easy, and anyone who tells you they were is leaving out the parts that matter. The winter of 1887 brought a drought in the summer preceding it that hit the wheat hard. They made it through on what they'd saved, and the expanded vegetable production, and a decision Evelyn made in August, watching the wheat and doing the arithmetic, to sell 2 of their older hens and use the money to buy a second milk cow before the prices rose in fall, when every other farm in the valley made the same calculation too late. Thaddeus had looked at her when she'd proposed it, had run his own figures, and had said, "Do it." They came through the winter tighter than the previous 2, but intact. The North 40 produced its first full yield in the summer of 1888, 3 years after Evelyn had first looked at the problem in the ledger and proposed approaching it differently. The drainage tiles had done what Thaddeus had known they would, and the raised beds did what the bulletin had promised, and that summer they brought in a harvest from those sections that made the ledger look different in a way that wasn't thin anymore, not wealthy, not prosperous in the advertisement sense, but real. A cushion that had depth to it, room to make a mistake and recover. Thaddeus stood at the edge of the North 40 in late August of that year, after the harvest, in the particular evening light that the valley made in summer, and he was quiet for a long time. "You all right?" Evelyn asked from beside him. "This section has been a problem since I filed the claim," he said. "For 5 years, every spring, I watched it flood and thought about what it was costing me. And now? And now it's the best producing section on the property." He looked at the field. "I couldn't have done that alone. The combination of approaches, I had the pieces. I didn't see how to put them together." "We put them together." "Yes," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him, at the side of his face in the evening light, at the man who had written 12 careful lines in an advertisement and had meant something true in them even when the specifics were wrong. She thought about the word together and what it had come to contain, not the soft, easy version of it that people used when things were working well, but the actual version, which included the February argument about flour and the first winter's grinding cold and the night in the barn with her hands going white around a lamp she wouldn't put down. "Thaddeus," she said. He looked at her. "I want to teach," she said. "There are 4 families with children inside 7 miles of this property who have no access to a school. I've been thinking about it since spring." He was quiet, which was not a negative sign with him. "Where?" he asked. "I thought the barn could spare the south corner on weekday mornings in the winter months, when we're not in full operation. In summer, we could use the yard." She'd thought this through. He would know she'd thought it through. "I'm not talking about stopping any of the farm work. I'm talking about what we do with the time we now have, because the farm is running better." He turned back to the North 40. "How many children?" 8 or 9, I think. Maybe more if word got around." "It would get around," he said. "Nothing stays quiet in this valley." "I know." She paused. "Is it all right?" He looked at her. "It's your time," he said. "And you're a better teacher than you think. You've been teaching me things since you got here." She shook her head. "That's not the same." "It's more the same than you want to admit." He turned toward the cabin. "Set it up how you need to. I'll help with whatever building you need." She stood at the edge of the North 40 for another moment after he walked away, looking at the field that had been a problem for 5 years and was now the best section on the property, and she thought about what it meant that a problem could hold that much potential, and that sometimes all it took was looking at it from a different angle, with a different set of tools, with someone beside you who saw what you couldn't quite see alone. The school started in November of 1888 in the south corner of the barn, exactly as she'd planned, with 8 children between the ages of 6 and 13, 3 of them from the Halverson family, and 2 from a homestead to the north run by a widow named Ferris, who'd brought her children west from Minnesota the previous year and who became, over the following winters, one of Evelyn's closest friends. It was not a proper school. The benches were rough wood that Thaddeus had built in 2 days. The books were mostly ones Evelyn had brought from Boston, and some that she wrote out herself on paper she got from the Bozeman supply store. The lessons were practical as much as they were academic. She taught the older children to keep accounts, because she had learned what a difference that made. And she taught all of them to read with the conviction of someone who understood that reading was the thing that had made the rest of her life possible. Thaddeus sat in on one session, uninvited and quiet in the corner with a piece of harness he was mending, and he watched her work with the children for an hour and a half. She only noticed him once during that time, and when she caught his eye, he looked back down at the harness. But she'd seen his face in that moment, the particular expression she'd learned to read, the one that had moved over the years from careful assessment to something warmer and more settled. After the children had gone and she was sorting the books, he said, "You're good at this." "I know," she said. "I told you in February of last year. You told me you thought you were good at it. That's what knowing something looks like before you have enough evidence." She stacked the last book. "Now I have evidence." He set down the harness. "The Ferris boy, Thomas, he couldn't read at all when you started. He can now, slowly, but he can." "That's not slow," he said. "That's 2 months." She looked at him. "When I came out here," he said, "I didn't know anyone. I just worked. I thought that was enough. Work the land, keep it going, build something that lasted." He was choosing his words with the care he always used when he was saying something that mattered. "I didn't understand what lasting actually meant. I thought it meant the land." He paused. "It means the land and what you do with it, and what you build on it, and who you teach, and what they carry with them when they go." She was quiet for a moment. "That's from the poetry volume," she said. "That way of thinking." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's from watching you teach a boy to read in a barn in November." He picked up the harness again. "Either way, Mott." By 1890, the farm had expanded to 90 acres through the purchase of an adjacent parcel from a family that had given up and gone back east. It was not a large purchase, and it was not easy. They'd saved carefully for 2 years, had run the numbers until they knew them without looking, and had made the decision together on a February evening with the ledger open between them, the way the ledger was always open when they made decisions that mattered. The new parcel brought the total productive ground to nearly 70 acres of workable land, and with the drainage problem solved and the approach refined over 5 years of iteration, they were farming all of it. Thaddeus read everything he could find. This was something that had grown between them the way good habits grow, gradually and then completely. He'd always read, alone in the evenings with his modest shelf of books, but Evelyn had brought books from Boston and had ordered others, and they'd built a collection over the years that now covered 2 full shelves along the cabin wall and spilled onto a third. He read history and agriculture and philosophy in the same way he approached everything, methodically, with a pencil in hand for the parts that connected to something he was already thinking about. He was not a quick reader, but he was a thorough one, and he remembered everything he read in the way that people remember things they've actually thought about rather than just processed. The poetry volume with the inscription for Margaret stayed on the shelf. Evelyn had never asked about Margaret, and one evening in the spring of 1889, unprompted, Thaddeus had told her, an older woman, a neighbor's wife in Ohio, when he was 21. Not romantic, the kind of older person who hands a young man a book and says you should read this and doesn't make a thing of it. She died before he'd left Ohio. He'd taken the book because no one else seemed to want it. I thought about putting it away when you came, he said. Figured it might look odd. Having a book from someone who was kind to you? A woman's book. It would only look odd if I were the kind of person who found that odd, Evelyn said, which I don't think you actually believed I was. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, I didn't. Then why did you think about putting it away? Habit, he said, of protecting things I didn't want to explain. He looked at the shelf. I don't do that as much anymore. She knew. She'd noticed the shift. Years ago, really, long before he'd have said it out loud. The things he used to carry alone, he'd started setting on the table between them. Not all of them, and not always easily, but more of them, more often, with less of the careful withholding that had been his first language when she'd arrived. It was, she thought, the truest form of what had changed between them, not the practical things, though the practical things were real. Not even the love, though that was real in the way of things that have been tested and held. It was the withholding. The careful curation of self that they'd both arrived with, she with her 11 drafts and her borrowed confidence, he with his 12 lines and his understated loneliness, and that they'd both, slowly and incompletely but genuinely, put down. She was 34 when their daughter was born, in the spring of 1890. They named her Margaret Ruth Hale. Ruth for Evelyn's mother, dead 8 years by then. Margaret for a woman in Ohio who'd handed a young man a book and changed what he thought was possible for him, though neither of them put it in those terms. It was Thaddeus who suggested the name quietly one evening when they were talking about it, and Evelyn had looked at him and said, yes, that's right. The birth was hard. There were 2 days in it that Evelyn did not look back on with anything other than grim recognition that some things are as difficult as they are, and no amount of preparation makes them otherwise. Thaddeus was there for all of it, in the way he was present for difficult things, not able to fix it, but completely refusing to be anywhere else. When it was done and the baby was there and breathing and real, he sat beside the bunk with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, and Evelyn, exhausted and aching and not yet fully herself, reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. All right, she said. He looked up. His face was wrecked in the way of someone who'd been holding something very tight for a very long time. All right, he said. His voice came out rough. We did that too, she said. He looked at her and then at the baby, and then back at her, and he said, quietly, without drama, in the plain way of a man who had found the words, I don't know what I did to get this lucky. She shook her head. You didn't get lucky, she said. You chose it. You answered a letter, and you drove 14 miles in the cold, and you taught me to milk a cow, and you fixed the barn roof, and you worked beside me every day for 4 years. She looked at him steadily. That's not luck. That's everything luck isn't. He put his hand over hers on his shoulder. And you, he said. And me, she agreed. Here's what I believe, having told this story. We spend a great deal of time looking for the right circumstances, the right situation, the right conditions under which our lives can properly begin. And I understand that instinct. It comes from somewhere real, from the reasonable hope that things might be easier than they are, that the ground might be solid before we step onto it. But Thaddeus Hale stepped onto 63 acres of partly unworkable land in a valley that didn't care whether he made it, and he stayed and worked it until it became something. And Evelyn Whitlock got on a train to Montana with $47 and skills she'd borrowed from watching other people. And she stayed and learned until she became someone who could stand in a frozen barn in the worst winter in years and hold a lamp steady because the light was needed and she was the one holding it. Neither of them waited for the right circumstances. They built the circumstances. That's the thing about the frontier. Well, not the Montana frontier specifically, not the historical fact of it, but the frontier that every person stands before at some point. The edge of what you know. The territory where your current skills are not sufficient and your current self is not quite who you'll need to be. That frontier is terrifying, and it is also the only place where anything permanent gets made. They lied in their letters, both of them. And then they arrived and told the truth. Not all at once, but piece by piece, in the ordinary circumstances of shared daily life, which is the only way truth really gets told between people. And what they built from that truth, the farm, the school, the family, the life, outlasted the letters, outlasted the lies, outlasted everything they'd been before they stepped into that shared territory and decided to stay. Margaret Hale grew up knowing how to read accounts, and how to milk a cow, and how to look at a problem from every angle before deciding which tool to reach for. She grew up watching her father read poetry at the kitchen table that had replaced the rough one, and watching her mother teach other people's children in the barn, and then in the small schoolhouse that the Valley's families built together in 1892. She grew up on 90 acres that had once been 63, and before that had been a problem, and she carried something with her from it. Not a lesson, exactly, because lessons are things you're told. Something more like a shape. A template for what it looks like when two people choose each other, not just once, but every day. Not just in the good circumstances, but especially in the ones that aren't. The Hale farm stood for a long time. It outlasted both of them, and what they'd built on it outlasted the farm. Not the fields exactly, not the barn. The other kind of lasting, the kind that travels in people, which is, in the end, the only kind that matters.